Today's episode, we're going to do one of the unknown periods of Canadian history, one of the great unknown events that changed Canada forever. Between 63 and 65, more than 100 bombs were planted in Montreal. And one of the most infamous scenes in Canadian news coverage was the filming of the bomb disposal Sergeant Walter Leja trying to disarm the bombs in a post box in Westmount. And today we have Ted Leja, Walter's son, to come and talk to us about Sergeant Walter Leja.
Basically, he lost his left hand. He couldn't speak and was partially paralyzed on the right-hand side.
Today's episode, we're going to do one of the unknown periods of Canadian history, one of the great unknown events that changed Canada forever. In my opinion, what occurred on May 17, 1963 was an absolute transition point in Canada and one that's never really been dealt with. Hey, well, what was it? What was it? It was whitewashed. That's why most people have never heard of it. But it was about the FLQ bombings, or the Front de Libération de Québec bombings in Montreal that took place in 1963. Not to be confused with the FLQ crisis of 1970. And in 1963, Canada changed. And Quebec and the rise of separatism took place, and really nobody knew how to deal with it because you had a problem in the political sphere. So we'll go back a little bit over the history. Quebec was ruled by a guy called Maurice Duplessis for many years, about 20 to 30 years. He was basically the dictator of Quebec, and he made sure there was no unsettling in Quebec politics. He made sure there was no resistance. There was nothing. But he died in 1958. In 1958, Quebec then had a new premier. His name was Jean Lesage, and Lesage's attitude was more maître chez nous was the expression. This is our home, basically, for the Quebecois. And this fertile territory started the development of some more revolutionary type groups. And the one that comes out of it most famously or infamously is the Front de Libération de Québec, the FLQ. So in the early 60s, these separatists start to move. And they're not really separatists only or nationalists. These guys are largely Marxists. They're also mostly teenagers, and they're run by a Belgian guy, and they're a very, very small group. But in early 1963, they start planting bombs. And then the bombs, between 63 and 65, more than 100 bombs were planted in Montreal. And many of them went off, some were diffused, and we'll talk about that shortly. In the meantime, this terrorist organization literally starts up. But politically, federally, Canada is under a minority government. So you have to understand, to win in Canada, you got to win in Quebec. And so when Pearson takes over from Saint Laurent in the late 50s, he loses decisively to Diefenbaker, but Diefenbaker again gets his votes from outside of Quebec. Then you have a minority government run by Diefenbaker in 1962. Then you get a minority government run by Pearson in 1963. Pearson knows he has to get that Quebec bloc to keep power. And if he comes down too hard on these nationalists, which included people like Pierre Trudeau, he would lose the votes in Quebec. So you get this period of them not knowing what they're going to do. So it really hits ahead in early 1963. A few bombs go off. A World War I veteran who was a night watchman at the Black Watch Armories is actually killed when he goes out for his smoke. And then other bombs start to go off. And when we're dealing with this, we're talking about what happened in May 17, 1963, after a number of bombs have gone off. Now they're putting them in the post boxes. And one of the most infamous scenes in Canadian news coverage, live media, was the filming of the bomb disposal Sergeant Walter Leja trying to disarm the bombs in a post box in Westmount. And of course, we'll talk about that a little bit later, what happened to Sergeant Leja. But in the meantime, nobody knew what to do about this because the FLQ were a very small group of people, mostly like radical teenagers run by a Belgian guy. And they were just basically chaotic. And they were following the Marxist revolutions and nationalist revolutions of the IRA and of the FLN, of the separatist movement in Algeria. So this is where they were getting their inspiration from. And they were able to run roughshod because without Duplessis' firm hand around, people could do basically what they wanted. Most of the Quebecois had never heard of these guys before and really weren't sure what this was really all about. There was a sense of nationalism, but not to the point of violence. Now, when we talk about history, we're going to talk about the one event when the bomb went off in Westmount on May 17, 1963. And it's my opinion that Canada never knew how to deal with the Quebec problem after that, still doesn't know how to deal with the Quebec problem after that. So on this day, it changed. It changed more radically than even the First and Second World War because we had no federal solution for the problem. Now, also, when you're looking at the history, you're looking at the rise of Quebec nationalism, you're looking at the rise of the terrorists, but that's the macro side of it. That's what's happening to the country. But every part of history has the micro side, and the micro side are the individuals. And the heroic actions of Sergeant Leja on that day, when he's disarming the third bomb, when the bomb in Westmount went off in his face. And it's a terrible, terrible incident. He was a Canadian veteran of the Second World War. And today we have Ted Leja, Walter's son, to come and talk to us about who he was and what it was like during that period and what happened after that period. Because all this stuff was put under the carpet. Nobody wanted to talk about it. They wanted to win the elections, and they allowed this just to slide away. How many people have heard of the bombing on Westmount, May 17, 1963? Almost nobody. Nobody. Why? Go to the memoirs. There's hardly anything in the memoirs. Go to Pearson's memoir. Go to Diefenbaker's memoir. Go to their biographies. This is completely whitewashed. And you recognize that this was one bomb out of more than 100 that went off between 1963 and 65. On a personal note, our family moved from Montreal in 1965 because of all the bombings. And my father worked for Bell Canada, and he moved to the headquarters of operations in Ottawa Hull here. But the guy it really impacted was Ted Leja. So Ted, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
My father performed a very heroic act on that day, but no one really knows much about him. I know he was put up in the Quebec legislature to be a hero of Quebec when they put up one of the Rose brothers in contradiction. Can you tell us a little bit about your father?
My father, if we want to go back in time, in his early life, it kind of gives you some idea of what I would call self-reliance. My father had two sisters along with an older married sister. By the way, they were born in Poland, in the southern part of Poland. The interesting thing was that my grandfather, who was a widower, it was a poor time in Poland, and he decided that he had to come to Canada to work, and he had to leave his kids behind. But he thought he was doing the responsible thing, was that he had someone who's going to look after them. And what happened was that he kept sending money to these people to look after them, but the person never gave them the money or never fed the kids. So my father, who was at the age of about maybe 11 or 12 with his two sisters, decided that he had to feed them. And so he would go out and he would be stealing food. It's a very rural area from farms and whatever. I'm not sure how long he did it, for a year and a half or 2 years. And so as time went on, he had to wander, as this is a 12-year-old, further and further to be able to feed his half sisters who would have starved. They would have all starved. And what happens finally, one of the neighbors figured out what was going on and sent a letter to my grandfather, who was in Montreal, and the grandfather sent the money for them to come to Canada, and that was in 1935. That's like an amazing situation. He was self-reliant. He was open to learning everything, and so that's the best way of describing them. They eventually settled in Point St. Charles. The Point at the time had two of the most important employers in Montreal, which is Northern Electric and the CNR shops. And most residents preferred to live near their jobs, so the point became their home. It's a working class area, so with multi-ethnic, French, Canadian, Irish, lots of fights between those groups. And at age 14, he decided he had to go to school or whatever, and had basically still had very little schooling. And what happened was that he eventually learned the language and spoke English, because obviously when he came from Poland, he only knew Poland. And so basically, I always remember my father as I never noticed an accent in him at all.
He's just a teenager. He's come to Canada. He's working in Point St. Charles, which was a very tough area, and but I guess at some point he felt he was Canadian. So as the period went on and the war came,
yes,
explain a little bit about his war experience, because what's sad about this case is that they were trying to blow up the Anglos, and all they ended up blowing up is a veteran of the Second World War who's Polish. He ended up being the collateral damage, literally, of the FLQ. So, but I like his Second War experience, enlistment. Obviously, he's a patriot, or he never would have enlisted.
In 1942, he decided to enlist, and it was the 17th Duke of York Hussars, which was the 7th Recce Regiment. So he spent 2 years in England. Part of that, what did you call that? The Forgotten Army, and came basically a week later on D-Day, and as part of the 7th Reconnaissance.
I'll just add that the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment, which was the reconnaissance regiment of the 3rd Canadian Division that landed at D-Day and fought all through Northwest Europe, ultimately in Holland and even into the Rhineland. And they took a lot of very heavy casualties. And whenever you go to the Canadian cemeteries, you'll see a lot of the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment's fatalities in that area. So these guys fought a serious war through that period.
In his armored car, what he would do is he would be posted behind the enemy lines, and that was his task. And in so more than one situation, he suffered friendly fire from it was P-51 Mustangs. Then he moved through the Channel ports, which was Calais, and then afterwards, once the British had liberated Antwerp, we still had a major problem because the port was not open because the Germans occupied the Scheldt. So it was the Canadians' job, that dirty job, to be able to liberate the Scheldt, which is what he did. But in early spring, somewhere in about, was it April or May of 1945, someone in Allied command said, "Oh, we seem to have forgotten a country." So they, the whole of Canadians liberated Holland. And one of my father's major experiences that a farmer came up to him as a Canadian soldier and said, "My wife's about to have a baby." So my father became basically delivered the baby. And that gives you some idea of his time in Europe. He had been wounded a couple times, and as well listed as missing in action, especially when he was working behind enemy lines. So my grandfather got maybe 1 or 2 telegrams being missing in action, presumed dead. That gives you some idea on his time in World War II.
When did he come back to Canada?
About 1946, and he started again at CN, and being somewhat of an entrepreneur or whatever, he got involved in driving taxi, and there was a taxi company in Montreal full of veterans. It was called Veterans Taxi, and so became almost like a fleet owner. He only had 1 vehicle. That lasted until about 1953, where he joined the Army again and was a quartermaster sergeant. And I always remember him as spending his time reading books, whether it was in engineering, whether it was in mathematics, whether it was in physics. He just absorbed it like a sponge. And another incident that I forgot about, at the armory, there's a Hillside Armory in Westmount. There was a it wasn't a live grenade, but they have a special name for this type of grenade that's used for practice, which actually was described to me, has a certain amount of explosive to, just to show it or something of that nature whenever you throw the grenade. This grenade became live. Well, first of all, what my father did was he wanted to protect everybody else that was around him, so he put his hand on it, and it did explode. But if it had been a real grenade, then he would not be with us. He would be just pieces, but it hospitalized him, so he had this hole in his hand and whatever. So that's an example of what he did, and showed that when he was dismantling the bomb was he wanted to protect everybody else. And so I think he was in the hospital for about a week. So as time went on, he became a bomb disposal expert, and he actually trained members of the Montreal police, which would have included Leo Plouffe, and we already met Robert Cote, and there's another person whose name was Andoni. These are some of the people that I remembered, and this kind of leads to the events that are starting to happen into the 1960s.
So the issue on this base is that he's with the Royal Canadian Engineers. Is that correct?
Correct.
So he's permanent force in the Royal Canadian Engineers, and he's doing bomb disposal as they would do. Of course, the cops would not be doing bomb disposal because that's not really relevant to Montreal in 1962. But by the beginning of 1963, how old were you in 63?
16.
So he's in a situation. Did you know what he was doing at this time, even prior to the big event?
Good question. I had some idea of, you played with bombs and whatever. And with the bombings going on, he never really talked to me about it, but he talked to my mother, and my mother passed on some of this information. So the number of bombings where he actually neutralized the bombs, I don't have I don't have a lot of information on that, but he probably was involved in a few. And as I said, from the news that I remembered from about 1962 and whatever, I would more hear about members of the Montreal police. Leo Plouffe became the celebrity. If there was a bomb somewhere, it was Leo Plouffe that was involved in it. And the mix of where my father came in and where Plouffe did not that is unclear to me.
So the issue here is that they originally they were throwing the bombs at the armories. They were throwing at the Van Duze armories. They finally planted the bomb, and I think it's April 63. They planted the bomb, which actually killed O'Neill at the Black Watch Armory. So this whole thing has started to intensify. And from everything I can find, from talking to Bob Cote and these other people, no one seemed to know who these guys were. Like no one really had an indication as to. I mean, they weren't obviously not high profile in terms of what they're doing, but no one knows much about them. And so I find, like, in the end, they planted the bombs in the mailboxes in Westmount, and basically, I guess at some point your father would have got called in on the 17th, and he had to disarm a number of bombs. Is that correct?
That's right. There was 3 of them on that day, and they were, to the best of my knowledge, they were all planted and set by the same person. Okay, so if you have the first bomb, I don't remember much about the first bomb, but the second bomb was close to Westmount High, and across the street was a vacant field. Right now, there's a huge apartment complex that's part of it. And he noticed it. It's very easy when you set a bomb, you're using the hour hand and the minute hand to be able to, the closer they are, they close the circuit and boom, this happens. I think that he could see from that bomb that they were that close. And to the best of my knowledge, when he crossed the street and he parked it behind a tree in that vacant lot, then the bomb went off. So then comes a third bomb. So it normally, if you're setting a bomb, you set it to the same, more or less to the same time to go off. So I think by the time he came to the third bomb, he had some true idea that, yes, I've been lucky for 2 times, but the third one is a problem. And I think he could see that as he was trying to dismantle the bomb and to cut the wiring, that the hour and the minute hand they had to be, like at one point almost touching, and then they did touch, and you know what happened. And he probably had the option of to be able to leave, to get the hell out of there because the bomb is going to go off, but he chose not to. So that's kind of like my thinking right now as to what happened. And the bomb went off.
These bombs were not fragmentation bombs. These were TNT.
Correct.
So these are put together for explosive purposes, so they're much more deadly than a fragmentation bomb. So which is going to try to kill you with the fragments as opposed to the explosion. The thing on this, of course, is that this is all done on film, right? When he's working at the third bomb on Westmount, they have the TV crews are there, the Gazette is there, the Montreal Star, everybody's there, right? So they're actually watching your father go up to the post box, and it goes off. Now that film is quite famous or infamous, I would say, and that's your dad. That's your dad there. What happened to you as a 16-year-old on that day when that bomb goes off? What happens to you?
Well, if you're, the day itself is really it starts. It's a Friday. I'm in high school. So I go to high school just as normal. My mother goes off to work in the factory in Blurry Street. She's a sewing machine operator. My father goes off to his job. Normal. And somewhere around 10:30 or I say 10:30 to 11:30. I can't really remember. So we'll just say 11 o'clock. I get the principal of the school, Frank Bertrand, comes into in the classroom and wants to see me, and I don't know what's going on, and so he's instead of waiting until he gets to his office where there's a member of the army to drive me, I said, "What's going on, Mr. Bertrand?" He said, "Well, your father's been in an accident and it's serious." And so they take me into the office and they drive me to, there was a Canadian Forces base in Longueuil. Right now, I don't know where it is. But by the time that I arrived, because he drove me there, I lived in Longueuil, and this was in Longueuil, so it didn't take me long, but my mother was already there. And so we start talking to the colonel, and the colonel says that he gets a phone call, and then he kind of like stops everything, and then he's making an announcement that your father is dead. And we both kind of get emotional or whatever, and so what happens now? And then the whole topic of how we handle the funeral and all of this and whatever starts coming up, and my mother says that he wants to be cremated, and the military doesn't want to do that because cremation is normal right now, but in the early 60s it was not. And foreign, I don't think maybe he was going to get a military funeral, and the military was not willing to do that. And then we're going through all this, and my mother's insisting, like she's uh, having to learn that she's got to be assertive in whatever she wants, later on, for what she wants to do for her husband, and in what the medical treatment that her husband's going to have, as but she was just, this is how she describes it, as I had to be assertive at that point on, and from that point on. And then suddenly there's another phone call, and the phone call says that the first thing that the colonel says is, "Good news." Like, what? I mean, he'll into this and say, "What the hell is good news? He just died." No, he's surviving, and he's on his way to the hospital. And as it turned out, there was 2 hospitals in the area. One was a Queen Mary Veterans Hospital, a Vets Hospital, and the other was St. Mary's Hospital, which does trauma. And the ambulance driver, there's 2 versions of it. The ambulance driver was supposed to take him to Queen Mary Veterans, which makes no sense at all, because you take someone like that to a trauma hospital. And so whenever the Army called the Veterans Hospital, they said he wasn't there. So because he wasn't there, so he must have gone to the morgue. So he died. So that was like the first phone call. But in reality, the ambulance driver would take them automatically to the trauma hospital, a general hospital, which is St. Mary's Hospital, which is where he was. And so we all got a lift to St. Mary's Hospital, and that was an interesting point. I had a story of a doctor lived, and he just happened to be home, right near the bomb site on Westmount Avenue. And so he was one of the first persons to give first aid or whatever, basic, save my father's life.
What are you thinking at this time? What are you doing? Tell me what you're doing, because you're my mom died when I was 17, and we were fucked. So what's going on in this situation? Do you know what's going on? Are you in shock? Is your mother in shock? What's the reaction?
I don't think none of us were in shock. I just think we had things that we had to do because of the circumstances, and this is what we did, what we had to do. Like my mother, sat around. It was like for 3 days, we didn't know what in the world was going to happen with him, because he was being operated. One of us actually met a surgeon who actually saved his life, in St. Mary's Hospital. But that's like a long time ago. But you just get some idea on what I am. I wasn't in shock, and my mother wasn't in shock. All that happened was that because of the events, and I think she spent 2 or 3 nights at the hospital, and in the process of not being able to sleep, eventually for the rest of her life, she ended up being hooked on sleeping pills, of this variety and that variety. So that's one result of it. Now, after about probably, I can't remember the time exactly, after about maybe a month and a half, it could be 2 months or it could be 3 months, he was transferred to Queen Mary Veterans Hospital, and where he was going to recover to a certain recover. For a while, we kept thinking that he was going to recover back to what he was before, which is an insane mindset. But that's like another story. How in the world do you come back from, basically he lost his left hand, and was partially paralyzed on the right hand side. So that's one idea of what had happened to him, and we really weren't aware of for a long while, or accepted the mental damage, like that had happened to him.
When I watched this, and I knew about this when I was growing up, I just assumed that he went back to normal. So even when you came on my tour a few years ago, I was quite, I just thought the guy was okay. I didn't realize the extent of the damage of these TNT blasts that took off they took off his right hand or left hand.
It was the left hand, and so we had to learn to use an artificial hand.
Could he speak? Could he talk?
No, he could not speak. That is a problem. And in a while, he kept figuring when he was making noises, he kept thinking that he was speaking and that we all would understand. And so for about a month or so, when we didn't understand, he'd get frustrated. So that was really hard for him to expect that he couldn't communicate, and I think he lost his ability to be able to read. So this is really this is hard when you look at a man who in the fall of 1963 came home, and he and we had him for about almost 2 years at home, living at home with us. He couldn't speak. He had a reduced ability physically to do anything. And this is a man who built things. He built 2 houses, and he built 2 boats, and he couldn't do any of this before. And when it finally hit him, he got really depressed. And at times he would just walk out the door. He'd walk normally, except he had a heavy limp, and he'd always tell us, like this is the end for me, like in some ways. You'd ask him a question, especially if he was angry or whatever. Do you want to do this? And he'd shake it and say, yes, yes. And so he'd walk towards Jacques Cartier Bridge, and I assume he wanted to jump off it, obviously, but he never made it, because we had great relations with the police. That they would either follow him, and if my mother called the station, she would say, "There's no problem, madame. We have somebody with him, and somebody is bringing him back." So this went on and on to the point that in 1966, it was just better for him to be in a military hospital, and that was, that's in St. Anne de Bellevue, St. Anne's Military Hospital. So from 1966 until 1992, when he passed away, he was at the hospital, and he acquired a friend there who was a painter, Mr. Finn, who made great paintings for someone of his. And so Mr. Finn took him under his wing, and so my father started making paintings so good that other people, in essence, started to notice them. And what would happen is you start giving paintings to people. Thank God, like he had something like this and something in his life, because everything else had been shattered, is the best way of describing it. If you could figure this man could build anything and learn anything, and he couldn't.
How did your mother handle this? Because this is brutal. So how did she handle it over the years? So we're talking decades, almost 25 years in St. Anne de Bellevue.
What she did was she traveled. In the beginning, I kept thinking she went every day, but that doesn't make any sense, because that's over an hour in a trip to St. Anne de Bellevue. So she would go like 4 times a week without fail until he passed away. So, and he passed away from pneumonia, the complications. And so we've come up to basically 1992. When you talk about my mother, how faithful she was, going 3 times a week, 4 times a week to St. Anne de Bellevue from Longueuil, which is a long way. I mean, it's such a long distance, it's such a long way that.
So here in this situation, in the immediate post explosion, they thought he was going to die. They pronounced him as dead. He came back, and then they started to operate on him with these severe injuries. You're looking at paralysis. You can't talk. You've lost your left hand. You're partially paralyzed on the left side or the right side? Left side?
Partially paralyzed on the right side. Now, that is a problem, because it took longer to be able to learn to use an artificial hand because it's the opposite side of the body is what controls the artificial hand. So
what did the government do for you? What did they do for you after this? What did they do for your dad and your mom?
they had their pensions. That's probably the thing that I remember that the government did. And we also had, if we want to go beyond the government, the city of Westmount set up a fund, and people were donating money to the Walter Leja fund is basically what is about the extent of it.
Now, your father performed a very heroic act, and the Army did recognize him, right? They recognized him with the award of the George Medal, which is the
correct
time equivalent of a Victoria Cross. Now, do you remember anything about any ceremonies or any presentations when they gave this?
Well, this is in March 1964. We, as our unit, we were transported to Rideau Hall, and so I got to meet Governor General. The Governor General was Georges Vanier and his wife Pauline. So that was very nice because they were interesting people to be able to talk to, and I guess the best way of describing it is they didn't, in official positions, talk down to people. No, they were very decent people, and that's except the memories that I have of Ottawa, my first trip to Ottawa in 1964.
So he won the George Medal, which is that's a big deal. And for you personally, how did this period? I mean, your father's alive, but he's sort of not quite there, is he? I mean, how did you deal with this?
Well, I think that I lost a guiding hand at a very critical part of my lifetime, which is age 16. In a proper marriage, you need to have, the mother has a certain influence and the father has a certain influence, and that you can't substitute them and change them. So that's one of the things that I was missing was that positive male role model hand that was no longer there. Yes, you could say my father was alive. Oh, yes, he was, but he wasn't there. It was just someone else is the best way of describing it. Yes, he was my father, but it's not the same. You can't talk to him. You can't ask him for this information and that information.
Were you angry? Were you angry?
Probably yes. When I look back in time, was I angry because I didn't have the guiding hand of my father at age 16? That's the last thing you're thinking about. What happens is that your task at that point is as a teenager is to rebel against this system and that system, which is what I did. But I just have to look back and see what I missed and how having a guiding hand might have affected what I'm doing right now. I think it had a major effect.
People did this to him, though. The people that actually did this to him. Now, as I recall, they captured all these. They infiltrated that FLQ cell, and they actually found out who the guys were. They paid them off. They bribed them or something for information. They did this to your family. Are you angry at them?
It doesn't do any good. Is the first way of describing it, and sometimes it's easy to associate who these people were, what their ethnic background was. I mean, you can look upon Quebec separatists and say, well, they were French Canadians, and look what the French Canadians did to me, and like that. I never clued in, and I never looked at it that way. I just like them, and that was it. I didn't say necessarily the separatists. I didn't understand it at that particular point why in the world they could do this. But as time went on, I think you have to be able to forgive these people for the errors that they, the errors that they made, whether they acknowledge it or whatever. That's not my problem. I got a life to live, and it doesn't do me any good to hold bitterness and anger and whatever. So that's today.
Your father was a hero. He sacrificed himself basically for other people, which is the definition of heroism. But his event was largely forgotten. Now, as you were growing up, or as you got older and you got into some history, did you find it sort of strange that these events were sort of whitewashed from Canadian history?
I don't know if it means, like they were whitewashed. It's I think in my own mind, I just wanted to forget, as time went on, the events and the trauma. I shouldn't use that word trauma. The stress that
no, it's
provided to me and my mother. She called it the accident. That day is, in her mind, is the accident, and basically she wanted to forget it, and basically I wanted to forget it. And in the process, what happened is that yes, we didn't look at the macro point of view and see why in the world that the events of that day were ignored. Yes, we would get, some people would say, what's the famous words? Leja, are you in any way related to Walter Leja? I mean, we get this once in a while, but that's the extent of nostalgia.
So did they how about his comrades? Like when you talked to Bob Cote and some of these other people, did they follow up with you afterwards? Did they follow up with your father?
I can't remember. I think that he had members, certainly members of the regiment that came to visit him. Whether, I assume that Leo Plouffe would have come, but I wasn't always in the hospital, and I think that it would be the only decent and whatever thing to do, to be able to look to check it in the hospital on your mentor. And Cote, we never asked him the question, but I'm sure he probably did. So that's the simple thing. Oh, I wanted to bring up a story of the CO of Hillside Armory. His name was Langston, and when he first visited my father at Queen Mary Vets, he was convinced that my father stood up and had an intelligent conversation with him and like sleuthed him and all that information, which made no sense at all, because my father had lost his speech, and in the process, some of us just got so excited with the thought that, yes, he's going to change. Yes, if he spoke once, yes, he's going to speak again. That was, in the long run, very hard. And when eventually we realized that this was not the case, and the colonel must have been imagining it. And I nothing against Colonel Langston, but the events and whatever didn't happen, as he said.
How do you feel about your father right now, like with what he did and what he suffered, and how do you feel about
it? The only thing that I can say is that he was definitely a hero. I mean, as we said, many instances where he thought of others, in dangerous situations over himself, and he had a record of doing it. Yes, he's a hero, and part of me is that I lost someone, and I lost a father at age 16. That's one way of describing it, and you know, that's a shame. You know, I can't go back and change it. Part of the experience of living, of having a father like that, is that eventually I ended up doing a lot more research on his background, on his time in Poland, and you know, I didn't know about all this, you know, what he had done when I was age 16. So I'm learning, and I started using ancestry.com, and actually found someone from the same village called Konioka, which is in southern Poland, just on the border with Slovakia. And this person lived in the village, and then in the process, we've gone through the family to back to the 1600s, and I actually visited the village in 2013. So it was nice to link up and get some idea on who this person was.
He was not forgotten. When I gave a talk at the Black Watch Armories, and several of them knew him. They and commented on him. He was still legendary in that area. What's sad is that because because of the political circumstance, you can see that they really played this down. You know, don't ruffle any feathers, and they're not even sure whose feathers they're going to be ruffling. But the issue is and then of course things got even worse in 1970. Cote said it was at the 68 or 69 Grey Cup. He disarmed a bomb of 100 pounds in a Volkswagen Beetle outside the Grey Cup event. I think it was 69. And he was commenting on the type of bombs, because he's talking about the 4 sticks of dynamite, the TNT. And we were asking him if he would wear a suit, one of the suits. And of course, those are for fragmentation grenades or bombs. And he said, no, because if the bomb went off, then you'd have to carry an extra 85 pounds on the stretcher when you took me away. And he, of course, he had a very unusual attitude towards these bombs, because he talked about what they used for the timers, how they used West clocks, silver bell clocks for their timers, and to set them off. And of course, he was also trained in all the IRA bombs, which were far more sophisticated than the FLQ. The early ones, I think, were pocket watches, but they had different methods for this, and they were quite rudimentary, but they were explosive. And and these guys, you know, the FLQ's attitude, oh, we weren't going to hurt anybody, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. But these are high explosives. These are, if they go off, they're killing you. I mean, they're going to kill you. So your father was a D-Day or a Normandy man, a World War II veteran, a lot to be proud of. And what do you think his legacy is going to be now?
I don't know what his legacy is. I think that over time, we're looking at over 55 years. I think that people just get forgotten, and that's just, you know, just another person.
You don't have to forget them. Immortality is remembrance. It's always remembrance.
Yes.
As long as you keep mentioning those names, they live. They live, and they live forever. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think Norm, you've asked some very good questions, and it's almost like you've you know, exhausted what I can tell you.